All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is broadcast as part of a Stay at Home, a new series from Jacobin, where most days at 6 p.m. Eastern, we'll be talking with a left-wing thinker, then doing a short Q&A with them afterwards. So obviously, socialist politics is built on rallies and strikes and door knocking and all those things that we currently can't do as well because of physical distancing. Though Mike Davis on our first episode suggested that maybe we should have some protests anyway and some blockades. And today there's been a rash of walkouts from everywhere from a GM plant to Amazon to Instacart as well. But we took this opportunity at Jacobin to launch a video-based political education series. And a few times a week, actually, in fact, this week, all 7 days, Jacobin is going to host a left-wing thinker to explain an idea for around 25 minutes or so. Then we'll take questions from the audience for a brief Q&A. If you want to ask your question, you actually have to log into YouTube. Everyone has a Google account, should be able to do it. And ask some questions. And before I introduce our speaker, I'll just remind you that we have a host of speakers this week. We have Vijay Prashad talking about the rise of the BJP and the Indian right. We have Sabrina Fernandez talking about the same in Brazil. We have Tony Wood talking about what happened with shock therapy in Russia and how disastrous the transition to capitalism was in Russia and how that paved the way for the capture of the Russian state by the political right. And we'll have a rundown on the Jacobin website of those, but basically every day at 6 p.m. Eastern, we'll be doing those talks. So today, we are speaking to Karen Narefsky, who is a Jacobin contributing editor and organizer, and she's the co-editor of the spring 2019 issue of Jacobin, which focused on housing, and is pound for pound, I think, the very best introduction to housing issues and socialist perspectives on housing that's out there. Just for today and for the next 24 hours, we made the digital edition of that issue just $1. So if anyone wants to take a look, please do. Without further ado, I'll leave it to Karen to make the, left case for public housing, why it needs to be part of our vision if we're in search of housing justice.
Thanks, Bhaskar, and thanks everyone for watching. It's really great to be here. I mean, in many ways, it's not great to be here because we're all stuck. But I think it's good to know that this community exists and that we have really the ability to reflect a little bit in this moment and try to think about how we want to build a better world as we're coming out of this pandemic. So obviously, due to the coronavirus outbreak, we're kind of in a moment where things that were already obvious to many of us on the left are, first of all, becoming even more obvious and more extreme, and they're becoming apparent even to people outside the left. So last week, the New York Times published an article about the so-called pandemic caste system in the US. And they talked about how rich people are living in vacation properties, middle-class people are stuck at home with their kids, and working-class people are actually still going to work on the front lines of the economy, and many people have been laid off and are struggling to survive. So this is the New York Times all of a sudden realizes that we have a really stratified system of class inequality. And in some ways, I think it's pretty easy for us on the left to be kind of dismissive and even angry at these types of things because this is not new. And so it really shouldn't take a crisis of this magnitude for us to be able to respond to it. But I think it's incumbent on us to try to really seize this moment to address some of those really glaring inequalities. And one of them, obviously, and in a really fundamental way, has to do with how we house or don't house people in this country and what the housing system is like. So I want to talk a little bit about the housing crisis in the United States, how it relates to the coronavirus crisis, and to dig in a little bit to the history of how the federal government responded to the Great Depression with the creation of what we now know as public housing in the US. So obviously, housing is not just an issue that affects the United States, but I'm going to stay in the US. This is sort of the primary base of my knowledge. So hopefully it can be useful for us as we think about how we want to move forward in this moment. And apologies for the noises outside. I guess that's one of the occupational hazards of these types of videos. So right now in the US, there are over 500,000 people who are homeless. New York and California are two of the states with both the highest rates of homelessness and the greatest absolute numbers of homeless people. And homeless people, as we know, are at an elevated risk for transmitting and catching coronavirus because it's harder for them to keep things sanitized. You might be living in overcrowded shelters, and many homeless people are already suffering from underlying health conditions that make them more vulnerable to the effects of the virus. And so at a moment where the main directive from government is for people to stay at home, we sort of see the ways in which housing isn't actually a discrete issue that can be separated from the other issues in our lives. It sort of forms the basis of the way we live in many arenas. So we've seen the phrase emerge from a lot of housing organizers that housing is healthcare, because if you can't shelter in place, then you can't protect yourself and your family from infection. If you have mold in your apartment, then respiratory issues are exacerbated. And we know that the stress of housing insecurity leads to other health conditions. In New York, where I live, the borough with the most cases of coronavirus is Queens, where many people live closely packed together. And you have a lot of people living in illegal basement apartments because they can't afford standard apartments. So we were seeing in this moment how intimately linked housing is to healthcare. And it's also really intimately linked to education, because the neighborhood that you live in determines whether you go to a good school that has enough resources. Right now, whether you have reliable internet at home determines whether you can go to school remotely, or whether you're sort of struggling to get an internet connection and worrying about falling behind. And we know that housing is also really connected to the environment. People who are living in flood zones are at risk of losing their homes. We've seen events like Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, other events around the world that are becoming more frequent as climate change becomes more severe, and where people live really affects how vulnerable they are to these crises. So Daniel Aldana Cohen has done some good writing about this. He writes that sea level rise alone will displace some 13 million Americans this century in a good case scenario. Heat, fire, drought, and other impacts will displace millions more. So when we talk about housing, we're really talking about the quality of people's lives in a very fundamental way. And we know that as refugees emerge from the climate crisis, they're stuck in really packed housing conditions that kind of exacerbate all of these problems. So it's, this, as I said, these are not new issues, but they're really coming to the fore in a very fundamental way. And even before the outbreak of coronavirus, we really could see this in the presidential election. So in the 2016 presidential election, housing was not really an issue. Neither Sanders nor Clinton really spoke about it in the major debates. They had housing platforms, but they didn't really focus on them. It just was not an issue that was really foregrounded in the 2016 presidential election. On the other hand, in 2020, most of the candidates had put out housing platforms by the middle of 2019, with a notable exception being Joe Biden, who didn't actually release a housing platform until about a month ago, just before the South Carolina primary. And many of you will be familiar with Bernie Sanders' really transformative housing plan, which calls for national rent control, the construction of 2 million new social housing units, full funding of existing public housing, and an end to homelessness and restrictions on the inclusionary zoning laws that perpetuate segregation in our cities and our suburbs. So all of a sudden, we have a presidential election in which housing is an issue. It comes up on the debate stage. It comes up in a prominent way in people's platforms. And so that really has come from the organizing work that a lot of grassroots groups have been doing over the last 10 years or so, since the real weight of the financial crisis came to bear. And we have a we have some momentum that's been created to actually try to do something to address the housing crisis. And there's a number of, like I mentioned, really strong grassroots groups that are doing work around the country. And I think we're going to hear later on in the series from some organizers who are going to talk more about some of the demands that are on the table. So I'm actually not going to focus on those for tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our system of public housing and kind of how that was created during one of the last major economic crises in this country, the Great Depression. And so the Great Depression really is, in some ways, the more important historical analog, more so than the 1918 flu pandemic. By the end of the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, there was a major housing shortage in the country, but it's largely attributed to the effects of World War I and the impact that the war had on the cost of building materials. A lot of people had migrated to cities during the lead up to World War I, and there was a massive housing shortage. So by the early 1919, New York City, for example, had a 2.2% vacancy rate. Price gouging was rampant, evictions were rampant, and there was really the start of a very strong tenant organizing movement in New York City and New York State that led to the emergency rent laws of New York State that were in effect throughout the 1920s. And it is interesting to note, although I said I'm going to mostly focus on the US context, that although New York took some of the most far-reaching action in the country to protect tenants, it really didn't come close to the measures that were taken by European countries after World War I to restrict rents. So by the end of World War I, most of Europe was covered by some form of tenant protection. And that's really never been the case in the United States. We can see similar trends with the creation of the National Health Service in Britain after World War II. The United States didn't even pass Medicare and Medicaid until the 1960s. And even today, we're still struggling through our disaster of a private healthcare system. But that is a topic for another lecture. So if we're coming back to the emergency rent laws in New York, they were enforced throughout the 1920s and they expired in 1929, just in time for the Great Depression. Rent control actually didn't come back to the US until World War II as part of a program of national price controls. But it was in the 1930s, the early 30s, as part of the New Deal, that the federal government decided to intervene in the housing market by providing low-cost housing in urban areas, which became what we now call public housing. So, you know, the market crashed in 1929. By 1933, the housing market in the US had totally collapsed. New housing was almost not being constructed at all. Half of all home mortgages were in default nationally, and foreclosures were rampant. So all of this really spurred FDR to include housing as a priority in the National Industrial Recovery Act. And so this is there's kind of an interesting, slightly off topic, but I think relevant moment here, that in some ways the National Industrial Recovery Act was possible because of the reapportionment of Congress that took place following the 1930 census. So until then, Congress just kept growing as the population of the country kept growing. And so the waves of immigrants and migrants from rural America to cities did not really change the composition of Congress, because congressional Republicans, who knew that they would lose, they would lose representation to Democrats, because a lot of immigrant voters and urban voters voted with the Democratic Party. So congressional Republicans really resisted reapportionment until the late 1920s. And then based on the results of the 1930 census, the size of Congress was restricted, and this reflected basically 2 decades of major demographic change. So all of a sudden you have the House of Representatives, and to a lesser degree the Senate, with a lot of new members who are much more responsive to urban issues of urban poverty. So I think it's something for us to think about now. There's been a lot of attention to the sort of wild lack of democracy that exists in the current Congress, and how difficult it makes it to really get legislation passed that addresses the issues that most of us are dealing with. So anyway, back on topic, we have the National Industrial Recovery Act. We have a Congress that now is paying attention to issues of urban poverty. And so the NIRA establishes the National Housing Division as part of the Public Works Administration in 1933. And it starts off by providing loans to nonprofit corporations to build housing. Most of this housing was not like very deeply affordable for poor people. It was housing for middle class people. And this is a trend of American social housing efforts that goes back to the beginning of the country. So there were about 3,000 housing units built around the country. And then in 1934, Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, who's really responsible for the program, decides in addition to loans, the federal government's now going to be producing housing for poor people on its own. So this is really, in many ways, the heyday of public housing, 1934 to 1937. 21,000 units of housing were built across the country, including the Harlem River houses in New York, Jane in Chicago, and many other housing projects around the country. And the PWA at this time was also loaning money to labor unions to construct housing complexes like the Carl Mackley houses in Philadelphia, which were built by the Hosiery Workers Union. And so there was really, in this period of time, a very strong involvement of the labor movement in both advocating for federal funding and actually taking out loans and constructing housing for union members. So in the 30s, many central labor councils were organizing to push federal funding for these efforts. They organized into something called the Labor Housing Conference and put out a resolution calling on the federal government to treat housing as a public utility. So like I said, this was really kind of like the peak moment of the New Deal, the peak moment of public housing. By 1937, the country was coming out of the Great Depression, and the real estate lobby had started to organize itself a little better and actually be able to put together a coordinated pushback to this visionary effort of public housing that had been launched. At the same time, you had the Labor Housing Conference and other housing advocates working with Senator Robert Wagner to pass the United States Housing Act in 1937. And so this marks like a little bit of a shift in the framing of public housing. And we're actually going to show a short video from that time about how public housing was discussed and framed.
The story of homes, of how a people live, is the story of the foundation on which a nation is built. The United States is the most prosperous nation of modern times. It promises to every citizen equal rights to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, 10 million American families, 1/3 of the human resources of American democracy, are today living in slums. Wherever flies and garbage and children must occupy the same backyard at the same time, wherever dwellings are rotting or are fire traps, wherever privy vaults are open or water supplies are unsanitary, wherever too many people live squeezed in one room or too many families live jammed together, there are the slums.
So this period really marks the beginning of the scaling up of public housing in a pretty serious way. From 1934 to 1937, there was this kind of like pilot of public housing that produced a lot of units and a lot of inspiration. And the 1937 U.S. Housing Act was actually the first of 3 major pieces of national housing legislation to pass over the next few decades. So the other two, the Housing Act of 1949 and the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965. So this is kind of the period in which most public housing in the United States is getting built. And this legislation allowed for the US government to fund local housing agencies to build public housing. So this created the housing authorities that we see in a lot of major cities and towns across the country. And it accelerated the construction of hundreds of thousands of public units across the country. So you do have in these decades a truly massive program of providing housing for poor people. And World War II really accelerated that. There were a lot of projects that were built as temporary workers' housing in World War II that were converted to permanent housing after the war. And so, I'll talk about some of the complications and challenges in a minute, but for almost 3 decades, public housing did create in a serious way an alternative to for-profit housing in this country. It gave a lot of people a comfortable place to live and sort of start their lives over after the Depression and after the war. And it created entire communities of people who were really connected through this new housing. A lot of people think, when we think of public housing today, of like the big modernist towers in the park, but there were also a lot of like smaller townhouses, apartment buildings, and low-rise developments that were created by the federal government. So if you travel throughout the country, there's a pretty wide sort of range in the typology of what public housing looks like. Many of the early New Deal public housing projects from the early 30s included amenities like childcare centers, corner stores, and beauty salons. And what's kind of interesting is that really the peak of American public housing is also the peak of the Cold War. So there's really a resistance to framing public housing as an alternative to the capitalist housing market. Instead, it's kind of framed as an effort to a way to jumpstart the post-war economy, to provide construction jobs. And this framing, I think, ends up being really problematic, along with increasing reliance on the private sector and the lack of like visionary leadership that we saw from people like Harold Ickes and Fiorello LaGuardia and the labor leaders of the early 1930s. And in many ways, this like shift in framing, I think, sowed the seeds for some of the decline of public housing. But I think it's important not to understate the really massive impact of those 30 years of construction of public housing, and that there was a moment where people could start to see housing as a human right and a public good, and not just something to be provided or acquired through the private market. So unfortunately, there were, as we all know, several really serious issues that have plagued American public housing and led to its rapid decline. And, there's sort of some interesting theories that actually, even going back to the earliest days of this country, that there's been like a very strong resistance to provide government housing support to the poorest, that there's always been kind of a sense that truly poor people don't deserve to have the government provide housing for them, that somehow they've brought their housing problems upon themselves. And I think in many ways, this kind of like individualist ethos has been very much cultivated over time in our national discourse. But one of the problems with this is that following the 1937 Housing Act, a lot of local public housing authorities were created, but many municipalities treated them as a sort of like sinecure position or slush fund. So you had mayors appointing cronies to run local housing authorities. There was widespread corruption and some serious mismanagement, actually. Folks from Chicago will recognize this in the Chicago Housing Authority, but it's certainly not the only case. And another major challenge came up in the acquisition of land, and this really intersected with a really problematic approach to racial segregation in public housing. For local housing authorities to acquire housing in central city areas often was really expensive, and so many sites were acquired on the outskirts of town, far away from jobs and public transportation. And so then the segregationist practices that were embedded in a lot of the public housing construction at the time further entrenched racial discrimination in public housing. So local housing authorities would pick an all-white neighborhood and construct a housing project and say only white families can live here. And then they would pick a neighborhood that was majority Black and construct a project and say only Black families can live here. And so as these projects continued to proliferate, you saw a lot of civil rights protesters pushing back against the segregation of public housing projects, but it really, in many ways, started to crystallize people's image of public housing. And as public housing continued to lose support from the federal government into the 1960s, to become stigmatized, what you saw was like an increase in the population of people who didn't really have that many other options, rather than the initial vision of public housing as a more inclusive place where a mix of like working and middle class families could live. And so because of, there's like an interesting follow up to this, because of the discrimination that was like baked into public housing in many ways, in recent years, the federal government has started to enforce anti-segregation rules for not just public, but also federally funded affordable housing. This is obviously pre-Trump. Trump is not interested in enforcing these laws, but what this means is that now if you're receiving federal funding to build or provide affordable housing, you have to assign the units randomly based on a lottery, which makes sense if you're trying to prevent racial discrimination, but it also has an important impact on the involvement of labor unions in the construction and provision of affordable housing. Because if you're a labor union and you want to build a housing complex for your members, now you have to offer the units in an affordable housing lottery, and you can't guarantee that your members will get a preference for those units. So, you know, I think in many ways, not just due to this law, but we've seen a big shift in the labor movement's approach to social legislation and to public housing. And I think we're actually starting to see that swing back in many ways, but we're far away from the early 30s where labor unions were really playing a critical role in the provision of public housing. So basically from 1937 until 1973, when Richard Nixon enacted a moratorium on public housing, the federal government did spend billions of dollars to create hundreds of thousands of public housing units across the country. And so just kind of to reemphasize, this is a model of housing that is decommodified, that is not based on, people's investments. It's not based on like having a second home that you can spend 2 weeks a year in. This is really was intended to be and could have been a model to really provide affordable, safe, decent housing to many people across the country. And so if we want to use this moment to enact Bernie's housing platform of fully funding existing public housing, not to mention the creation of new social or public housing, it really is going to require massive investment on a federal scale, which is pretty sobering because the federal government is totally unequipped to handle this problem and pretty uninterested actually in doing so. Because the president and his whole family are real estate developers who have spent their entire careers profiting from urban decline and taking advantage of tenants. So you can see even in the stimulus package that was passed last week, there's a restriction on tax benefits for real estate investors that was lifted as part of that stimulus package. So even in this moment where like hundreds of people across the country are dying from coronavirus, Trump is like making sure that the stimulus package is going to include a tax break for real estate investors. So this is not going to be easy. We're in like kind of an insane moment. And even, this is, I do think it's important to say too, this is more than just a Trump problem. This is a problem of neoliberalism. During the last major economic crisis in 2008, so it was pre-Trump, we responded by bailing out the banks who had caused the crisis, evicting and foreclosing on struggling tenants and homeowners, and then allowing predatory private equity companies to buy up their homes. So this is really, over the last 40, 50 years, and arguably really since the end of the New Deal period, we've really seen a shift away from this ideal of public housing as a social good. And I think it's important to say it remains to be seen how coronavirus will impact the housing market. During the 2008 crash, investors bought up foreclosed homes and sort of really commodified them. And even in New York, market rents stabilized, but they didn't really fall. So the rental market in New York didn't tank the way some people might have expected. And I think given the financialization of the housing sector, we need to expect that real estate developers and investors will be ready to take advantage of this moment to continue to squeeze tenants and low-income homeowners. but we need to use this moment to push forward an alternative, especially now that it should be clear to more people that whatever we've been doing since the last economic crisis is not working. And I know, as I said earlier, there are many people in different cities and states around the country who are working on different solutions. There are folks in New York and Massachusetts who are trying to pass legislation that would allow tenants to acquire their homes when they go on the market and turn them into tenant-run cooperatives or bring in a nonprofit owner. So I think this encourages us to think about public housing, not just as the construction of new housing, which I think in many ways it has to be, but also as bringing existing housing under a social framework, bringing it under tenant ownership and government control. And this is a moment where, despite all the bullshit of the Trump administration and the entrenchment of neoliberalism, people want to talk about public goods. There is an appetite to talk about that really hasn't existed in our political discourse for a long time. Medicare for all is popular. Free higher education is popular. We have legislators like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib introducing social housing legislation at the national level. We have Bernie Sanders and other presidential candidates really trying to include housing as part of their platform. And so we need to really use this moment, I think, to push. We know it's not going to happen during the Trump administration, but we need to use this moment to create the vision and the framework of a national program of social or public housing that would be resident controlled, that would not be means tested, that would actually be well designed and constructed, and would be fully and adequately subsidized by the government. And so we need to build that vision on the one hand, and as part of doing that, we also need to really build powerful organizations. We need to continue to build our grassroots organizations. We need to continue to build relationships with the labor movement, with unions like 1199, who are starting to get involved in visions for social housing for union members, and to really politicize tenants around this demand so that we can promote a new vision of what's possible. So I'll stop there. Thanks everyone for listening. Looking forward to hearing questions.
All right. Well, we've been listening to Karen Narefsky. Thank you for that, Karen. Karen's a Jacobin contributing editor, an organizer, and also the editor of an excellent housing issue that Jacobin did last year. So if you have any additional questions, please do send them in the comments. And as a reminder, tomorrow, Lee Phillips is on to talk about why the free market can't really deal with pandemics like coronavirus, from drug research to not adequately funding public infrastructure. More and more, if you look at the American response to coronavirus, even compared to other capitalist democracies like Germany or South Korea, America's looking like a failed state. And in part, it's because of our fealty to this certain variety of free market mantras. And I guess it's fairly depressing, but we do have a few questions, also depressing, but one from the comments. We associate public housing in the United States with a lot of problems. Obviously, underfunding played a big role, but I guess, Karen, can you speak to the question of density? So in a class society where we are going to have social stratification, wasn't one of the problems of public housing just the scale and the fact we were concentrating poverty? So I guess this is kind of a version of an article that you often hear, article of faith you hear on kind of liberal kind of circles, but is there a kernel of truth there?
So, I think there's 2 points in there. This is a great question. Thank you. One is that I think it's actually useful to sort of, for all of us to expand our idea of what density can look like. As I mentioned earlier, we often have this kind of image of the like modernist towers in the park, public housing, and those often are lower density, per square foot or per acre than different kind of models of construction that may be less tall, but take up more of the land area. So they're actually, density can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 50-story tower. It could be a lot of smaller apartment buildings next to each other. I think there's a lot of ways to conceptualize what a large-scale program of social housing could look like, and the ways in which we could take advantage of density and also provide, different types of designs that can adapt to different urban or suburban environments. And I think the other question about the concentration of poverty actually is a big problem with the ongoing means testing and restricting of public housing. And this is a problem that really has been baked into a lot of the public housing that's existed in this country. There's always been this debate about who really deserves to get public housing, who deserves government support. And so initially, a lot of the public housing was restricted to sort of respectable middle class families. And then there was, a shift over time towards really restricting provision of government housing to the poorest families. And there wasn't always a lot of integration of different income levels and different sort of classes within public housing. And so I think one of the things that we really need to think about, in the same way that we push back against means testing in other public programs, is to make sure that we're building a program that really is broad, that is accessible to the poorest people, but that is also accessible to people of slightly higher incomes, and that we aren't concentrating poverty, that we aren't concentrating people by race, that we're really sort of building on a integrationist model.
All right, so one of the questions, I believe Robbie Nielsen's question, I think we just kind of answered, how to avoid mean testing, why it's important to avoid mean testing. Mm-hmm. There are other questions that could be kind of grouped together. One is soliciting you for examples of public housing in other countries that could be models for improvement of our own. And related to that, is there any precedent in expropriating empty apartments for, already? So these, this commenter is thinking about the empty luxury apartments in New York City and looking for historical precedents or precedents in other countries.
Yeah, so I think there's actually a precedent going on right now in California. I think a lot of people saw the group Moms for Oakland that had people who are occupying vacant homes to avoid homelessness. And I think now during the coronavirus outbreak, they're pushing a larger scale takeover of vacant homes to house homeless people and other people who are at risk of homelessness. And we should do that. We should be looking for vacant housing that is safe. I think we don't want to be creating a problem where people are just ending up in really dismal, unsafe conditions. But we want to, there's a ton of vacant housing, warehousing of vacant units by landlords who are holding out for a higher paying tenant is a huge problem. So we should be organizing to take over vacant housing units, I think, as much as possible. And I think, Bhaskar mentioned earlier the issue about the Jacobin housing issue that came out last year. There's a number of articles about social housing models in other countries. A lot of people are familiar with the European models in Vienna, in the UK until quite recently, actually, in Sweden. But there also are some really interesting models from Latin America, from Bolivia and Uruguay and Chile that are mentioned in the issue that are worth looking at as well.
Yeah, in other countries like in Singapore, for instance, public housing isn't really even the domain just of the left. The right has kind of decided, at least as far as I know, that with land so scarce, it might make sense to make high quality, dense, public housing. But here, of course, it's an issue that even good liberals who might be on board for other issues like single payer healthcare don't seem to really want to broach. So there was another question that I think was kind of addressed a bit because you mentioned Bernie's plan, which has a plank around funding existing public housing units. But the gist of this questions sent in by Arthur was, we have 100,000 NYCHA managed units in New York. We have to defend and improve those units. So I guess maybe one way to rephrase it in a broader way is, all right, public housing has a lot of problems, but we kind of have to defend what we have, because if we tell everyone that public housing is a total disaster everywhere in the US, then it might be harder to advocate for new and better public housing. So you could maybe just speak to NYCHA and that dilemma a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, I know this is a huge issue for people who are organizing in New York. I don't know for folks who are outside of New York how closely you're following it, but up until actually quite recently, New York City public housing was really considered to be one of the best run and like highest quality public housing authorities in the country, that there were still a lot of people living comfortably in public housing. And over the last few years, I think the level of mismanagement and deterioration and really also starvation from the state and federal government have become apparent. And it's fascinating because the mayor of New York worked in HUD, the governor of New York worked at HUD. So these are people who have connections to the federal housing kind of apparatus, but there has been both really a lack of accountability and a lack of proper funding in the New York City Housing Authority. And it has led to like a rapid deterioration in conditions and a lot of challenges for people who are living in public housing in New York. So I think on the one hand, to kind of respond to the comment, yes, we do need to defend what we have. It's not inherently a failure because public housing has to be a failure. It's it's struggling because you have to do it right, and we don't really have leaders who have been doing it properly at the state and local and federal level. So I think we can both say this is an important institution that we need to preserve, and we need to figure out how to do it differently in the future.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Just as a reminder, we just listened to Karen Narefsky on the history of public housing, why we should ban new public housing construction as part of a broader push to decommodify housing. And tomorrow we have Lee Phillips on why the free market can't handle pandemics. We have Vijay Prashad on the rise of Modi and Hindu nationalism in India on Wednesday, all at 6 p.m. Then Tony Wood on how the transition to capitalism devastated 1990s Russia. So again, not very cheery, but important stuff. And on Friday, kind of capping off our study of the rise of the right in these various countries, Sabrina Fernandez on far-right leader Bolsonaro in Brazil, and how he took over Brazil and what a disaster it is. But then on Saturday, we changed things up with a story that has a good ending, which is Matt Karp on how a mass movement was born in the 1850s that managed to end U.S. Slavery and the particular dynamics of this mass movement, why we need to think about mass politics and not just Lincoln as a lone kind of emancipator when we think about this period. And then finally, at noon on Sunday, Grace Blakely from Tribune in the UK will break down the Labour Party leadership election, which would have just concluded by then, and talks about why the, what's next for the Labour Party after Jeremy Corbyn. So I hope you'll tune in and tell your friends about these. We're going to be doing them basically every single day for the next 30 days. And, again, if you have any suggestions, comments, or whatever, drop us a line. So far, all the questions and comments and feedback we've been getting on the series has been great. I imagine once this series expands its audience, the comments will get a lot worse, which is a good thing. So that's what we're looking for. The comments are too high quality, which is never a good sign. But I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. And thank you so much, Karen, for taking your time today.
Thank you.